welcome to this week's edition of World Today. We begin our show with an India Today exclusive. Now, even as foreign ministers of India and China were meeting on the sidelines of the G20 summit for a 45-minute long conversation, China continues to build its adversarial strength. India today has learned that China's People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, has ordered purchase of over 2,000 pieces of combined mace that fall under the category of cold weapons. Now you're wondering where a mace would be used and what really is a mace. Well, it is the weapon that was used by the Chinese forces against the Indian forces in Galwan during the clashes of June 2020. And it could very well be used against India yet again. In fact, there's no other place that China could really use these weapons. So what are Xi Jinping's plans for India and for the border standoff? Here's a report.
The dragon speaks a forked tongue. Despite the diplomatic bonhomie at a display between India and China on the sidelines of last week's G20 meeting in New Delhi, India today has learnt of China's nefarious preparations for a repeat of Galwan. In January this year, the Chinese army put out a tender for the purchase of spiked maces, and a month later the purchase was made. According to information on the military procurement network, the PLA issued two announcements on procurement inquiries on the military procurement network. One is a mace and the other is a combined mace. These spiked weapons have become common features at the line of actual control between India and China. With Chinese President Xi Jinping now elected for a third term, what are Beijing's plans for India?
Still be complexity, there will still be ups and downs in the relation, and the fact that the maces were purchased recently, it is indicative that the relations are not going to be stable going forward.
While according to some reports, the People's Armed Police in Tianjin have used maces in the past as a deterrent weapon to deter criminals during patrols, the PLA have also trained with the same for combat. Another report has highlighted that the PLA has placed an order of 2,600 such maces. According to the purchase order, the length of the mace is around 180 centimeters. It consists of three parts: the hammerhead, the rod body and the rod drill. Among them, the hammerhead is about 50 centimeters, equipped with fine steel spikes and sharp corners at both ends, machined, welded and quenched to ensure strength, and the rod body is made of zinc steel pipe. On Chinese social media, some worried netizens have also speculated that the PLA would use them to deal with the ordinary people. But the larger worry is skirmishes on the India-China border as the summer approaches.
Information was leaked on Chinese social media, and a citizen picked up on the fact that this could only be used on India-China border. There is no other place where maces could be used, and because there is a past, there is a history of such instruments, such tools being used, this is going to be used on India-China border by the PLA in the future.
On June 15, 2020, Ladakh's Galwan Valley witnessed a violent clash between the armies of India and China, where these mace-like weapons were used, resulting in the death of 20 Indian soldiers, one of the worst in 45 years, and led to a military standoff with China and numerous rounds of military talks for the disengagement process. While India has been pushing for diplomacy and talks, the days ahead could be rather tough. With summer searing in, the heat might be felt at the India-China border as well.
This was an India Today exclusive, and to discuss a little bit more on this, we have two very important China experts, Suyash Desai, who himself was a part of reporting on the details of this urgent purchase by the PLA, and Manoj Kevalramani, who is with the Takshila Foundation, also joins us. Manoj, many thanks for joining us. Let's begin with you. An urgent purchase is what we're looking at with the PLA purchasing combined mace. Now, we know where the Chinese have used it, particularly at the India-China border. A lot of social media chatter about how it can be used for domestic purposes as well. But in this day and age, where we've seen a lot of protests, and most of them have reached social media platforms, doesn't seem like China is going to use these cold weapons against their own people. Particularly, it looks like it is for the India-China border.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Look, I mean, the first thing that we look at is who's buying these weapons. If it's the PLA, then it's not meant for domestic purposes. If it's the armed police, then they are the ones who are part of sort of looking at domestic disturbances. Secondly, what we've seen is that increasingly with the use of technology, Chinese domestic protest management has become extremely sophisticated. We saw this a couple of months ago when the protests erupted over the COVID-19 lockdowns, and eventually those lockdowns ended, partly because the protests played a role in that. You didn't see the kind of violent crackdowns, you didn't see the kind of beatdowns. So we've not seen the Chinese forces use such tools domestically, and there is no reason that it seems that they would use that when you can contain protests by using modern technology, surveillance tools, by blocking off access, and those means have worked extremely well. So there is absolutely no reason to tell us that this is going to be used domestically. It's clearly meant for the India-China border, which is where they've been used in the past. We are seeing that the India-China border is in a state of armed coexistence, and it's going to likely remain in that state. How do you escalate without entering into an escalatory cycle, right? One of the ways is to use weapons which are lethal, but not necessarily firearms. And this is the answer that it seems like it.
Okay, so Yash, coming to you, you also have been studying and looking at these reports very, very closely. You were part of our report on the story as well. But the larger picture, now this is Xi Jinping's third term, and we're looking at some conversations taking place between India and China. Would you weigh in on what China's plans could really be when it comes to these weapons? It doesn't seem like China is looking at conversations, dialogue, and diplomacy to resolve the crisis.
Thank you so much for having me. I think these weapons are indeed going to be used on India-China border because of there are two or three reasons because of how these weapons are made, how these weapons are purchased, where these weapons are being trained. I'll come to that question later, that aspect later. But going forward, because these weapons are being purchased, and because there is a precedent of using these weapons in the past on the border, these weapons, it can be said conclusively that it is made for India-China border. Also, you have to take into account the 4 agreements that India and China have signed over the border between 1993 and 2005, where firearms couldn't be used or cannot be used in these areas, and that is why the two countries have resorted to cold arm weapons in different types of cold arm weapons. But now that these maces are being purchased, and they are, if you see the tender carefully, they are categorically being made to suit the PLA in such areas, such topographies, specifically against India, to deter India. This is very conclusive of the fact that these are going to be used on the India-China border, and this leads us to understand how China is thinking about India right now. Buying of such weapons and de-escalation of tensions on the border, complete de-escalation of tensions on the border is a conclusive enough evidence to show that going forward in next 3 to 5 years or 10 years, the border problems are going to escalate.
Manoj, it is quite interesting that while on the one hand we are seeing diplomacy, negotiations, various levels of talks between the two sides, this is a crucial year for India, Manoj. We are seeing the SCO summit and the G20 being hosted by India in New Delhi and various other places. But the fact of the matter is that Xi Jinping's plans for the border are very different from what India envisages. And that's very clear from the purchases that we're seeing, from the statements that come out of Beijing.
Yeah, look, I think there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Firstly, what Beijing appears to be doing on the border is that it recognizes that the power dynamics have shifted quite significantly. The old agreements no longer hold as much they did. So it's trying to sort of use force to try and define and see what new red lines can be established, right? You push as much as possible to try and define where there is resistance, and then you sort of develop new red lines and new approaches. Now, when it comes to the G20, the SCO, I am of the view that we are unlikely to see Beijing wanting to disrupt these meetings in that fashion by using the border as a tool to disrupt them. We've seen that during the foreign ministers meeting, there was sort of some degree of, for the lack of a better word, jugalbandi between Russia and China. And they sort of abstained from agreeing to certain paragraphs of that statement that India had put out at the end as the chair. So I think you're going to see more of that as opposed to necessarily pushing things on the border. Because when you do that, you also create this sense of Beijing being willing to use force, and it becomes something that is an international limelight, right? It gives India the sort of diplomatic edge in that context. So I don't think that it would be using the border as a tool to disrupt the G20 and the SCO. Rather, there are other things that it can do to sort of exert its influence at those forums. So I don't think the border is something that we should be worried in that context. But generally, in the long sort of game that we are playing on the border with China and the Chinese are playing with us, we should expect a much more volatile areas. We should expect much more volatility because there is a new system of trying to push to see where you hit resistance, and that's when you start to define what can be new red lines, and then perhaps we might see some stability.
All right, then let me just take this to Suyash again. The fact that this might not be connected to, although it's a very crucial and critical year for India, being the host of G20 and SCO, might not be connected. But can we then expect problems at the border, irrespective of where the meetings are taking place, what meetings are taking place, that China is preparing herself for more border tensions and standoff with India, and therefore the kind of weapons, the specifications that we've seen in this report clearly spell out an agenda for the PLA.
Irrespective of what is happening in diplomacy, border problems are going on for a while. So I agree with whatever Manoj has said, that these are not going to relate, they are going to be interrelated with each other. For a very long time in the past, Galwan happened in 2020, and for the past 2.5 years, the border problems are happening in varying degree. And before that, this started in 2008 when the crystallization of ideology started, and still border problems were happening since 2013. So I don't think this is especially to do with the upcoming meetings. But yes, as we go ahead, looking at what has happened in the past 2-3 years, the border problems and how China is changing its approach towards different borders, the border problems are going to increase over the at least next 5 to 7 years.
To wait and see how China continues the standoff at the border and what India's response is going to be should China continue using these weapons as a part of their military strategy and tactics. On that note, Manoj Kevalramani and Suyash Desai, many thanks for joining us here on World Today. Political instability, economic crisis, terrorist attacks, assassination attempts, conspiracy theories, you name it and Pakistan has it. At this juncture, Pakistani politics is nothing short of a blockbuster thriller. But what is going to happen in court on March 13th is really going to send the nation into a tizzy should Imran Khan be arrested. One will have to look at the case where he has been accused of not divulging or disclosing all the details of the money he earned out of selling state gifts that he earned when he was in power. But should he be arrested, what will the fate of the country be? Here's a look.
Former Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan has become the biggest cause for worry for those who once pushed him to the top position, the Pakistani establishment. Today he faces charges of alleged illegal purchase and sale of gifts given to him by foreign dignitaries while he was in office. News of his imminent arrest had caused an uproar amid party cadres, leading to unprecedented violence and protest.
Basically, there were two previous bail fixed before here. One was before the ATC court, another was before the banking crimes court. The ATC court basically granted him interim bail. Date will be announced shortly, whatever the date it is. And after that, Khan Sahib appeared before the banking crimes court, and after hearing the case on merit, the bail has been granted to Imran Khan.
Pakistani police on March 5th served arrest warrants to Imran Khan to ensure his appearance in court. But the Islamabad High Court suspended the arrest warrant and ordered that the former Pakistan Premier appear in court on March 13th. Imran Khan has been citing lack of security and threat to his life as reasons for not showing up.
There is no security at the courts. They know I had a threat against my life.
Khan has been demanding a snap election since his ouster from office in a parliamentary vote early last year. A demand that was rejected by his successor, Shehbaz Sharif, who has said that the vote would be held as scheduled later this year. It was during the countrywide protest campaigns last year that he was shot at and wounded at one of the rallies.
People always protect women, but he is a hyena who wants women to protect him. The supporters reach every place, but he doesn't reach.
A determined Khan went ahead and announced a rally in Lahore to kickstart his election campaign, but which the government banned because clashes had erupted with Pakistani police firing tear gas shells. Batons were used on supporters, injuring several on both sides.
First of all, I want to tell all my workers who are out on the streets where shelling is taking place, all of you please stop this. The rally that we had planned, we are not going ahead with it anymore.
Khan has been living in Lahore since November when he was shot in the leg by a gunman during a protest rally. Since then, he has only once travelled to Islamabad last week for court appearances in other cases against him. While the political drama unfolds, any action against Khan could foment political tensions and draw his supporters to the streets. An unnecessary distraction for Pakistan Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif's government that's struggling to shore up finances and avert a default.
Talking to World at a Glance, where we take you through some other stories from across the world.
Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese received a ceremonial welcome in the Indian Presidential Palace upon his arrival. Both the countries agreed to strengthen a broader economic partnership and boost their defence ties. Albanese's India visit is the first by an Australian Prime Minister since 2017. Iran had announced that its intelligence agencies have started making the first arrests after more than 5,000 students were affected by mystery poisonings beginning November last year. Ayatollah Khomeini had called for the perpetrators of the unforgivable crime to be tracked down without mercy. China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang said the Ukraine crisis seemed to be driven by an invisible hand that is using the conflict to serve certain geopolitical agendas. He also reiterated China's position on the Ukraine war amid growing tensions between Beijing and the European Union. This comes after EU questioned China's sincerity as a mediator when it refused to name Russia as the aggressor in the conflict. Warning the US, North Korea said any move to shoot down one of its test missiles would be considered a declaration of war. North Korea's foreign ministry also accused the US of aggravating the situation by conducting a joint air drill with a B-52 bomber and planning US-South Korea field exercises. UEFA said it will refund Liverpool fans who attended last year's Champions League final in Paris. Although UEFA initially blamed the Merseyside club's fans for the chaos, they later apologized following the release of an independent review. Fan clubs welcomed the announcement, but also said it does not excuse the UEFA or exempt them from criticism and lessen the need for them to implement all of the recommendations made by the independent inquiry. The streets of France once again witnessed chaos as protesters opposing the government's proposed pension reforms aimed to block the country. Many nationwide protest rallies attracted bigger crowds than previous ones since mid-January. Thousands took to the streets in Paris, including teachers, hospital workers, professionals and students. Looking to pile pressure on lawmakers, France's hardline union said there would be rolling strikes which could go on for days and affect oil refineries as well as the railways.
That's all in this edition of World Today. Stay tuned to India Today for all the latest news and updates. Goodbye and take care.